Before we begin, a quick favor. If you've been enjoying the podcast, would you consider leaving a review? It really helps others find this space and join us on their own healing journey. If you haven't already, you can get your free IFS meditations and the Self Led Pause Starter Kit at exploreifs.com. Welcome back to IFS Meditations and Insights. I'm Tim Fortescue, your guide on this journey toward wholeness through the lens of internal family systems. Together, we're creating a sacred space to explore, accept, and love all parts of ourselves. As we do this work, we open ourselves to experiencing divine love and living more authentically. Let's begin. Last week, I offered you a meditation in episode 260, The Inner Living Room, a place inside where every part of you is allowed to sit down. This week, we go back to the story, chapter 2 of Unburdened, a memoir in parts. I grew up in a trailer and then later in government housing on a street called Clay Circle in the foothills of South Carolina. And from there, if you stood in the right spot, you could see the mountains. Not close, not reachable unless you drove, but visible. That mattered to the boy I was, because those mountains meant there was something beyond what I already knew. Something my system was reaching toward before I had any words for it. This chapter is about the instinct to survive by looking at the horizon, about the parts of us that keep us alive by insisting that there's more. So here's chapter 2, The Mountains in the Distance. Chapter 2, The Mountains in the Distance. The mountains were never far, even when they were still only background. In upstate South Carolina, the Blue Ridge lived at the edge of the world I knew, steady enough to trust, distant enough to wonder about. They did not fix anything. They did not explain anything. But from early on, they carried another feeling for me: space, distance, a wider horizon than the one immediately in front of me. I grew up in government housing in a duplex where life could feel close in every sense of the word. Close walls, close tensions, close patterns. I loved my family, and I was embarrassed by them. Both were true at once, and both lived in me without resolving. What I wanted most at home was not safety from something threatening, but something quieter, to be understood, to be seen in the ways that mattered to me. That longing was not rooted in fear, it was hunger. Outside the house, a different part of me was forming. At school, at church, in any room where I was not family. A vigilant part learned early how to read the atmosphere, how to notice what earned approval, what brought attention, what made adults see me and say, "There's something in that boy." I performed. I read the room. I became legible in ways the world seemed to require. That was the outside work. Between those two, life could feel very near, too near sometimes. The mountains were different. They did not ask me to perform. They did not need me to read the room. They did not require explanation. They stood there in the distance, blue, quiet, and indifferent in the most merciful way. Long before I had any language for parts or protectors of the nervous system, something in me knew what it received there: relief, motion, freedom, peace, a little breathing room inside my own life. That is part of why Caesar's Head and Bald Rock mattered to me the way they did. They were not just scenic places, they were early companions, witnesses, places where the world felt large enough that whatever was tight in me could loosen a little without having to justify itself. The memories of those two places blur together in some ways. Bald Rock was where I went more often and stayed longer. A granite overlook with a view that opened the whole valley below. Caesar's Head was farther up the mountain, more of a touristy spot, but I would drive on up there too. It had a path that wound between two massive granite walls called the Devil's Kitchen. I remember walking through that narrow passage, the rock rising on both sides, the space barely wide enough for a body. It felt claustrophobic and thrilling at the same time. The walls closing in, the sky reduced to a thin strip above, and then the opening on the other side where everything widened again. Looking back, that passage feels like something: the tightness and the release, the compression before the view. Something in my inner life already knew that rhythm well. I remember one particular drive to Bald Rock. It was fall, the leaves turning, the air cooler than it had been for months. Late afternoon, the light going golden, the kind of hour that makes even ordinary landscape feel like it is trying to tell you something. I parked the truck and walked out to the overlook and stood there alone. The valley opened below me. The sky was enormous, and what I felt was not peace exactly. It was hunger, a hunger longing that was less about wanting a bigger life and more about wanting love, wanting to be known, wanting to be chosen, wanting someone somewhere to see me clearly and not turn away. I was a teenager. I was lonely in the way teenagers can be lonely without anyone around them recognizing it as loneliness. I had friends, I had church, I had family, and still something in me felt unseen in the ways that mattered most. At Bald Rock, that longing could exist without shame. The valley was big enough to hold it. The sky did not judge it. And for a few minutes, I did not have to pretend it was not there. That duality stayed with me. Bald Rock was a place I went with friends sometimes, and a place I returned to alone. Both were true. With the youth group, we would hike out there at night or in the early morning hours to watch the sunrise. Those were some of the closest moments of belonging I knew. The shared cold, the shared silence, the shared wonder of light breaking over the valley with people who were on the same path. Then it would end. We would go back to church, we would go home, and the longing for that community to continue would settle in me like an ache I could not name. Alone, Bald Rock held the deeper truth. I was hungry for something, I did not yet have. And that hunger was not small. By then, I had a little blue Dodge Ram 50, glittery darker blue, the kind of color that looked almost black in low light but caught the sun. I bought it myself for $1,400 from working part time. My first vehicle. It did not have power steering, which made it hard to steer, especially at low speed. And it was a stick shift, which meant I had to learn the clutch. I remember my ma helping me with that. Driving the hills in town, her patience in that moment, a quiet gift that asked nothing in return. Those solo drives became their own kind of practice long before I would have called them that. I was not setting out with a therapeutic framework. I would not have known those words yet. I just knew there was something about getting in that truck and heading toward the mountains that helped. Motion helped. Distance helped. The road helped. So did being alone. These drives were mostly in the fall. There was something about the mountains as the leaves changed, the air cooling, the light going thinner and more golden that I still associate with that landscape. The particular quality of October in the Blue Ridge, crisp, quiet, the trees going amber and rust, the smell of decay and sweetness mixed together. It matched something in me, though I could not have said what. There was a way the landscape opened something in me. The curve of the road, the rise in elevation, the long views widening as I moved upward, the sense that I could leave one atmosphere for another without having to explain myself to anyone. Nobody knew I went. It was private, unannounced. Looking back, I can see those drives were not random. Some part of me was already trying to find enough space to hear itself think, enough space to feel what it felt without immediate interruption, enough space to exist without so much adjustment. I remember the way the truck smelled, vinyl seats, the faint smell of motor oil, the cassette tape in the deck, always 90s Christian music, Stephen Curtis Chapman, maybe DC Talk, whatever came from the Christian bookstore. I would not have dared play anything else. That boundary was not reasoned. It came from somewhere deeper, from the fear based parts of me that believed even small choices could put me on the wrong side of God. The music carried me up the mountain the same way the road did, windows down because the air conditioner didn't work. The wind loud enough to make thinking unnecessary for a while, which was part of the mercy. Sometimes I would pull over at an overlook and just sit in the truck, not get out, not hike anywhere, just sit there with the engine off and the view spreading out below me, and let the quiet do whatever it needed to do. Those moments were not dramatic. They were not spiritual in any way I could have named. They were simply the first times in my young life that I gave myself permission to stop, to be still without being useful, to exist without producing anything or performing for anyone. And maybe most of all, enough space to feel free and peaceful. If I'm honest, it also felt like escape, not in a dramatic sense, more like slipping out from under the closeness for a while, out from under the embarrassment I felt about my own people, out from under the weight of wanting to be understood and not knowing how to ask, and out from under the performance the rest of the world seemed to require of me. The mountains gave me somewhere to go where I did not have to carry any of that, at least not for a little while. There was also church, and church was complicated in its own way. On one hand, it was one of the places where I felt most alive. I was known there, I was seen. People affirmed things in me that I could not yet affirm in myself. Granny Betty's friends picked me up every Sunday. There were rides and fellowship halls, and the sound of hymns that entered my body before I understood what they meant. The church in South Carolina, Pentecostal when I was younger, and then Southern Baptist through my formative years, received me with a warmth I could feel in my bones. Adults saw me. They called out giftedness. They gave me microphones and attention, and the particular kind of love that says, "We believe in you." But that seeing came with a cost. It was the place where I learned to perform most fluently, where the vigilant part of me sharpened itself, reading what the room wanted, becoming it, earning the approval that felt like love. The performance worked. It brought me belonging, but it was still performance. And beyond the church itself, there was a parallel path of people who invested in me, church mothers who took me under their wing and into their homes, my eighth grade math teacher, youth group leaders who would eventually help me find the conservative Baptist college 45 minutes away, the one that would open the door to California. These people saw something in me and acted on it. I was glad for that parallel path. It gave me something my home life could not always provide, the sense of being known, chosen, and pointed towards something. But even those relationships carried their own kind of fading. I would spend time at a church mother's house, cared for, fed, welcomed. Then I still had to go home. The warmth would thin on the drive back. The familiar aloneness would gather again. I was grateful and I was lonely, both at once. They loved me, but I was not family, and some part of me always knew the difference. The same fading happened after youth retreats. We would spend a whole week together, immersed in community and worship, in the kind of closeness that felt like what life was supposed to be. Then it would end. The van would pull into the church parking lot, parents would come, and I would go home to the quiet, to the closeness that was not the same as belonging, to the familiar atmosphere. The contrast was sharp enough that I could feel it in my body. The aloneness settling back in, the old embarrassment returning, the brief freedom already becoming memory. And yet, church was also where the fear lived loudest, the altar calls, the pressure, the unspoken message that love might be conditional, that God might leave, that safety required constant vigilance. So, even in the place where I was most affirmed, I was also most afraid. That doubleness shaped me. Church was simultaneously the place I was most loved and the place I was most terrified. And my body learned to hold both of those truths at once, which is its own kind of education in complexity. And the peace came right away on the mountain, not eventually, not after I had thought everything through. Something in my body seemed to know almost as soon as I got there that it could exhale. And my mind knew it too. The noise inside softened, the scanning eased. For a little while, both my mind and my body recognize the same thing at once. Here, at least for now, I was safe enough to loosen. But it did not last very long. When I got back in the truck and headed home, the peace usually faded quickly. The familiar atmosphere returned. The old aloneness returned. And with it came disappointment and the quiet weight of knowing I would not be fully understood there. That did not make the peace less real. If anything, it showed me how much I'd needed it. I do not want to overclaim what the mountains were. They were not salvation. They were not escape in any final sense. And they did not remove the realities waiting for me back home or back in town or back inside myself. But they were a horizon. And sometimes a horizon is holy simply because it reminds you that the world is larger than the room you've been living in. That matters when you're young. It matters when parts of you are already learning how to stay small enough, good enough, responsible enough, legible enough. The mountains did not undo those patterns, but they gave me a counter experience. They gave me a felt sense that there was more room, more life, more ways of being than the ones immediately available to me. I think that is why the mountains belong so centrally in the story, not because they were dramatic, but because they were formative. They offered spaciousness before I knew I needed it. They became one of the first places where my inner world did not feel completely crowded by the outer one. There is a kind of self regulation that begins not with insight, but with instinct. You do not know why you keep returning to a place. You only know that something in you can breathe there, something in you quiets, something in you comes back into proportion. Looking back, I can see those drives that way now. The glittery blue Dodge Ram 50, no power steering, windows down, 90s Christian music on the tape deck, the pull towards Caesar's Head and Bald Rock, the mountain air turning cool in October, the horizon opening, the temporary relief of not being so hemmed in by the performance the world required, or the embarrassment I carried at home. And maybe even then, something more was happening. Maybe the mountains were not only helping me survive what was near, maybe they were also teaching me to trust distance, to trust widening, to trust the possibility that the life directly in front of me was not the whole of it. Maybe one part of me went there to escape, and another part already knew those drives were pointing toward a larger life. That would matter later, though I could not have said how. It would matter when California began to call as more than a place on a map. It would matter when broader horizons started to feel less like fantasy and more like invitation. It would matter when parts of me that had learned to stay close to what was familiar began to make room for something larger, stranger, and more alive. Back then, I only knew that the mountains were there and that I kept going to them. That was enough. Sometimes enough is a truck, a road, a long overlook, and the quiet mercy of realizing that the world is still bigger than the life you know. And for a while, that bigness was one of the only places in me that felt free. I know that what I was feeling on those overlooks was not something the mountains gave me. It was something already in me that the mountains made room for. Self was there. It had always been there, quiet, unhurried, present without grasping, but in the closeness of daily life, beneath the performance and the longing and the weight of what my parts were carrying, it got harder to hear. The burdens clouded it. They did not destroy it. On the mountain, the clouds thinned, and something in me could remember what it was like to simply be without working so hard to stay okay. And that was chapter 2. Next week, I'll offer an IFS Insight episode connected to this chapter. We'll explore how the body finds its own ways to regulate long before we have the language for it. Driving, walking, nature, motion, solitude, the instinct towards spaciousness that lives in all of us. That wraps up another episode of IFS Meditations and Insights. If today's episode was meaningful to you, please follow, subscribe, and share with someone who might need it. A positive review helps more people find this healing work. And don't forget, you can get your free IFS meditations at exploreifs.com and pick up the Self-Led Pause Starter Kit. And if you want to follow along with the memoir, visit exploreifs.com/unburdened to be notified when it releases. Until our next session, be gentle with yourself. I'll try to do the same, because we're beloved human beings.